I guess I can start this evening by explaining why I'm standing up here during our Wednesday night series when we're supposed to have guest speakers. Julie texted me today from Louisiana. She said, "Who backed out on you?" Nobody backed out exactly, but Chuck Webster was originally scheduled to be here tonight, and he wanted to be with family in Texas, and so there was a song I wanted to cover, so I took it upon myself to move Chuck to singing night last Wednesday of the quarter and to take tonight for me. So oddly enough, in the quarter where we're talking about songs, we will not have a singing night. I hope everybody understands. We are going to be talking about the Song of Deborah from Judges chapter 5. So I invite you to get your Bibles out. I won't be introducing our speaker this evening. That'd be a little awkward for me. But Judges chapter 5 is our text. And I want to start by explaining a little bit about the structure of the text. Judges chapter 5 is a poem or a song that basically repeats the information given in the historical account in Judges chapter 4. Now, some people will look at that and they'll say, this is evidence of multiple authors, that some redactor took little scraps of history here and scraps of poetry here and put it together, and some might even use that to challenge the inspiration of the Bible. But this is not a problem at all. In fact, what you're looking at here in Judges 4 and 5 is a very common literary device that you find in ancient literature and you find in several places in the Bible. Probably most familiar to you would be Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Have you ever noticed when you're reading those chapters that chapter 2 seems to kind of back up and cover some material that we've already read in Genesis chapter 1? And some have used that and said, well, you know, there must be multiple authors and Moses must not be the author of the book of Genesis, and therefore it's not inspired. No, that's not what's happening at all. It's a very common way of handling material. Some have looked at Genesis 1 and 2 and said, well, the people that God created in Genesis 2 are different from the people God created in Genesis 1. No, that's not what's going on. This is very common for two chapters to repeat material. In Genesis 1 and 2, there's no poem involved, but you have it in other places. For example, in Exodus chapter 14, you read about the crossing of the Red Sea in a historical way. Then you have the Song of Moses in Exodus 15 that gives a poetic description of it. The book of Job is an example. Job chapters 1, 2, and 42 are historical, and it's like they're the bread on the sandwich of the poetry in chapters 3 through 41. Some things are repeated, but it's told in a different way. And so this is a very common structure that you find, especially in the Old Testament. And we're going to be mainly in chapter 5, but there's some information in chapter 4 that will be very useful to us in interpreting chapter 5. The song is in chapter 5, and that's what we're looking at. In order to understand it, I'm going to have to give a little summary of the story. This is in the book of Judges, of course, which is cyclical in its organization. There are 7 cycles of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance in the book of Judges. And that cycle is summarized in Judges chapter 2, verse 19. If you'll look at that, that kind of helps introduce it. I have it, but this thing is not cooperating. Like a lot of stuff after VBS, just, you know, all of us are moving a little slow. Maybe it'll fix itself in a minute. But here's Judges chapter 2, verse 19. Whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. And so that is the cycle that's repeated over and over again. The characters are different each time. but the story is basically the same. Except that the story gets increasingly worse. One cycle after another takes them further and further away from God. And it has been described as a downward spiral before, and I'm okay with that because, you know, the judges at the beginning of the story of the book seem to be ruling over a less worse Israel than the judges at the end. When you get to Samson and Jephthah, things have just really gone off the rails. So it is a downward spiral, but a more accurate description would be an outward spiral. Yeats' poem comes to mind, The Second Coming. Look at this part of it. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. He wasn't writing about judges, but those lines in particular that he wrote about Ireland in his time fit very nicely with the book of Judges, especially that phrase, widening gyre. Now, gyre is a word I wasn't familiar with when I first started studying this poem, but if you look it up, it's the rotation that a falcon would make, which he mentions in the next line, circles that you might see a bird of prey or a vulture make in the sky. And you notice he describes it as widening. That's how the cycles are in the book of Judges. In the first cycle, it's narrow, and it gets wider and wider and wider, and God is at the center. So what does that mean? With each cycle, they get further away from God. And that's the structure of the book of Judges. By the time we come to Deborah in Judges chapter 4, we're in the third cycle. She's the fourth judge, but we're in the third cycle. And you can look at Judges chapter 4, verse 1, and see the language indicates the cyclical nature, which says, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died." So you had Ehud and Shamgar, and as long as they were alive, the people were faithful to God. The judge dies, and they again do what is evil. They start back at the top of the cycle, sinning against God again, which throws them into oppression. The oppressor in this cycle is Jabin, king of Canaan, and his army commander, Sisera. And they oppress the people cruelly, chapter 4, verse 2 says, for 20 years. When the people cried out to the Lord, he raised up Deborah and Barak. Some people say Barak, some say Barak. I don't know how they said it. I'm going to say Barak. Deborah and Barak were raised up to deliver the people, and they routed, or rather the Lord routed the Canaanites before them, and they were successful in their victory. All the men seem to have died except for Sisera, the army commander. And he runs to the tent of his friend Heber the Kenite for safety. Heber is not home, but his wife Jael is there. She welcomes him in. He's exhausted. She gives him milk to drink instead of water. He lies down on the floor of her tent. She covers him with a rug. He falls asleep, and she takes a tent peg and drives it through the temple of his head into the ground, killing him dead. That's, in short form, the story told in Judges chapter 4, a story that you probably know very well about Deborah, the fourth judge. Now, having said that, I also want to point out the book of Judges is a book full of unlikely heroes. Look at this. This is very interesting, especially at the beginning of the list of the judges. And maybe post-VBS, you're singing the song in your head as you go through this list. I can't help but hear that tune in my head. But look at the nature of these judges. Othniel was an old man. He was probably 85 years old, the brother of Caleb, who with Joshua led the people into Canaan. Othniel is now an old man, but he delivered the people. Ehud was a left-handed man. And you think, well, what's the big deal? Maybe some of you are left-handed and you think, does that make me an unlikely person to be a hero? Well, no, not today, but warriors were trained to fight right-handed, making Ehud unusual. And God actually used his left-handedness as a tool to deliver the people. And then after Ehud, you have Shamgar. He was a Gentile, which of course makes him an unlikely deliverer for the people of Israel. Following Shamgar's one-verse description of his time as judge, you have Deborah, who was a woman. And just like being left-handed, there's nothing wrong with being a woman, but we all know that in that society, in that culture, women were oppressed and suppressed, and they weren't allowed the freedoms that even we have today. There's still some ground that we probably need to make up today with women. Well, back then it was really bad, and the last person that you would expect to deliver the people would be a female judge. But here we have Deborah. Gideon's a little different, although he was cowardly in the beginning. But with Gideon, he's a man that had an army of 32,000 Israelites, and God said, the army's too big. And so after whittling it down by allowing the timid to go home to their wives and children, they had, I can't remember if it's 22,000 left or 10,000 left, but they still had thousands left. And God said, no, that's still too many. And he whittled them down further with that test about drinking water. And he only took the men who would cup the water in their hands and lap it up like a dog, which got the army down to 300 men. Now, these stories all have a common theme: unlikely heroes. Why is that? The reason is the Lord wanted them to know, and He wants us to know, that they had victory and success and deliverance only because of Him. They weren't delivered by their own strength. They didn't win battles by their own strength. They won it by the grace and the strength of God. And so that's why you see so many of these unlikely heroes. That's the theme of the Song of Deborah. And we're going to look at it in 4 parts. First of all, we're going to notice unlikely deliverers. Secondly, we're going to notice unlikely people. Thirdly, unlikely means. And finally, we're going to look at unlikely expectations. So let's start, number 1, with the unlikely deliverers. There are 2, and both of them are women. Of course, you can guess the first one is Deborah. And if you have your Bibles open to chapter 5, let's look at how Deborah is described there. And basically, I just want to look at verse 7, which says of her that I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. A mother in Israel. Maybe she was a mother in the sense that she had children of her own, but she was also a mother to Israel in that she was a nurturer and a guide. You get more information in chapter 4 if you'll turn backward and look at verses 4 and 5 of Judges chapter 4. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. 3 things are said about her here. First of all, she was a prophetess, which just means a female prophet. There were many female prophets then, even in the first century days of the church. We know from 1 Corinthians 11 and other places there were female prophets. Philip the evangelist and deacon had 7 daughters who prophesied. They prophesied according to the order that God put in the church, meaning they prophesied in groups to women only, and when men were present, they would allow the men to lead, but that doesn't mean they weren't given the gift of inspiration. They could tell people without a written word the will of God miraculously. And this is what Deborah did, and she used it in her judgments, which we'll get to in a moment. But notice the second detail in her bio is that she was the wife of a man named Lapidoth. Now, I venture to say if I allowed some discussion on Lapidoth and I asked you, tell me some things about the man Lapidoth, you probably wouldn't be able to come up with anything. And there's a reason for that. This is the only mention of him in the Bible. It's basically a footnote. And I think he is mentioned for that very reason. While she was a prophetess and the 4th judge of Israel, aside from the events in these chapters, her life was relatively ordinary. She was a mom. She was a wife. She was the wife of an obscure, unknown man. who was relatively unimportant. And that's the kind of people that God uses for his purposes. Now, it's also said that she was a judge. And the judges of Israel had more roles than just the judicial role. Most of the time, men like Gideon and Samson were military commanders as well, maybe even almost to the level of a king in Gideon's case. They were rulers, they were military commanders, and they were judges. But you really see the judging role come out here with Deborah sitting under a tree called the Palm of Deborah, where she would make judgments on disputes among the people. They would come to her to learn how to handle problems, and she would give them, we assume because she was a prophet, she would give them inspired wisdom or advice to settle the disputes. So she was a very important person. We like to herald her as the only female judge and one of the great female leaders in the Bible. However, the Bible hardly mentions her in her own story. And whenever you get to Hebrews, there's this puzzling list of judges, and Barak is mentioned, but Deborah is omitted. And I just want you to think about that as we look at the first unlikely deliverer. She had to overcome the discrimination against women in her society. She had to overcome a lot of things. She was the first. And the second deliverer in the story is another woman named Jael. Now, I do want to read the portion of her in its entirety in the song. And this takes us near the end of the song in Judges chapter 5, beginning verse 24. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a noble's bowl. She sent her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he sank, he fell, he lay still. Between her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. Now this reads a little differently than historical literature, as you can see, but remember, we're reading a song, so the reiteration and the poetry is very clear here as this is set off in lines. But a couple of things to note from this. You notice, first of all, it is said that she was the wife of Heber the Kenite. Kenites were not Israelites. In chapter 4, verse 11, we learn that the Kenites were descendants of a man named Hobab, also known as Jethro, who was the father-in-law of Moses. And if you go back to the early part of the Old Testament, you learn about Moses' family, you know that he married a Midianite woman. So his father-in-law was a Midianite, and Jael was a descendant of that line of people. She wasn't an Israelite, which makes her unlikely, kind of like Shamgar that we talked about a moment ago. And then also, did you notice she's called in verse 24 one of the tent-dwelling women? Now, that could just indicate that she was nomadic instead of settled like the Israelite people. But Eugene Peterson translates that of the, let me find my place in my notes, of the homemaking women. And there is an interpretation here that it's an emphasis, like we saw with Deborah, of her ordinary home life. She was a mom, she was a wife, she kept her home as much as you could keep a tent as a home. And so she also had this ordinary layer to her, which we assume to be most of her life. She wasn't hero material, we would say. She was an unlikely deliverer. But notice something. Let's go to the historical record in chapter 4. We'll be flipping back and forth quite a bit. The man who was supposed to be the deliverer, the army commander, Barak, Deborah tells him the Lord has given her this message that he's to fight the Canaanites and he will win. And he tells her, I'll go if you go with me. You know that part of the story? Listen to her response in chapter 4 whenever he says that. Verse 9. She says, I will surely go with you, Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman, not for your glory, but for the glory of God. It's a very interesting statement. And I think you're seeing here why God used women at this particular time, just as he used a Gentile, left-handed man, an older man, just as he used Gideon in his circumstances. He was using these unlikely heroes to remind Israel again and again and again that when they had victories, they weren't getting victories by their own strength, but they were being delivered by the Lord God. And that they should stay humble because it was their pride that got them into trouble every time. It's foolish to seek your own glory. Remember what she says, it will not lead to your glory. That's something that some of us need to put on our bathroom mirrors. Not for my glory. Because if you live life for your glory, you're going to lose. And the reason for that is explained in Isaiah 43, verse 7. We are created for God's glory. So if you try to go against the purpose for which you're created, you're headed down a path of self-destruction. The only way to have a good life is to live it according to your design. And you weren't designed for your own glory. You're designed for the glory of God. I'm going to put some more poetry up. I'm sorry. This is Ozymandias. I've used it recently. I know I'm not forgetful. This comes up a lot. This was the poem that Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote in a contest with a friend. I don't know the friend or the poem the friend wrote because Shelley's poem was so good that it's the one that's remembered. But in their days, some Egyptian artifacts were discovered, and one was this busted statue. All that was left was the legs of the statue, and the head of the statue was separated off from it. Years of wear and tear and the elements had torn it up, and it was called Ozymandias. Some people speculate this might have been a statue depicting Ramses II, the pharaoh during the days of Moses. We don't know. But he wrote this poem about it, and it's about the foolishness of self-glory. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, that's the head, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. You get the picture? This statue, which was meant to be a monument to a man's glory, mocks him as it's wasting away, and nobody even knows which king it represents. At one time, the king it represents called himself King of Kings, but now nobody even knows who he was. And this is a good example of the folly of self-glory. Deborah told Barak, look, this is not for your glory. God will deliver through unlikely deliverers to show that it's for the glory of God. So unlikely deliverers. Let's go in the second place to the unlikely people, and the unlikely people in this case would be the Israelites. Now, as in every battle in the book of Judges and just about every battle in the Old Testament, the Israelites are outmatched. There's a reason why they've been oppressed by these people for 20 years, and it's because the Canaanites were very powerful at this time. And there's a little detail in chapter 4, verse 3 that's important. It says that Jabin, that was the king, and Sisera, the army commander, had 900 chariots of iron. Iron was hard to come by in those days, very difficult to work. It had to be worked by hand. It had to be mined by hand. Very difficult to come by. To have 900 chariots of iron was almost unheard of, and you were unbeatable if you had these iron chariots. And how did the people of Israel know? I would imagine that they made sure their enemies knew, the Canaanites did, made sure their enemies knew about these chariots. It reminds me of the Soviets back in the days when they would roll out their tanks on Red Square. They're still doing that. They didn't have as many tanks this year to roll out. It was kind of, well, it wasn't sad, but it was kind of embarrassing to see how small their arsenal was that they rolled out on Red Square this year. But that's kind of what I think of when I think of these 900 chariots of iron. They boasted about it. Maybe they rolled them out in some ceremony, but everybody around knew about the Canaanites and Jabin's 900 chariots of iron, and they were afraid of it. And this power had been able to oppress Israel for 20 years. And so let's talk about the people. You have two groups in this unlikely group of people to win this war. These weak Israelites who have been oppressed and enslaved and heavily taxed. And the first group are the faithful few. Look at Judges 5, back to the Song of Deborah, and listen to what she's saying about the faithful few, beginning in verse 9. My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord. Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who walk by the way. To the sound of musicians at the watering places, there they repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord, the righteous triumphs of his villagers in Israel. Then down to the gates marched the people of the Lord. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, break out in a song. Arise, Barak, lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then down marched the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down for me against the mighty. From Ephraim, their root, they marched down into the valley, following you, Benjamin, with your kinsmen. From Machir marched down the commanders, and from Zebulun, those who bear the lieutenant's staff. The princes of Issachar came with Deborah, and Issachar, faithful to Barak, into the valley they rushed at his heels. Okay, let's stop right there, middle of verse 15. So you hear some tribes mentioned here that you are not accustomed to hearing in war. You know, when you get near the end of Kings and Chronicles, it's basically Judah, Israel, sometimes Benjamin's mentioned, Ephraim is mentioned. You don't really hear much about the significance of Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali. In chapter 4, though, it's Zebulun and Naphtali that Deborah calls up to follow Barak into war. It's probably their territory where the focus of the Canaanite oppression was. And so these are the faithful few. They went to war. They followed Barak in. But sadly, not all the people got behind Barak and Deborah in this war. And so you have a second part of these unlikely people, a second population, the unfaithful majority. And this picks up with the middle of verse 15, where I stopped reading a minute ago. Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Okay, so what's wrong with that? You know, it's good for us to search our hearts and to think and meditate. So far, Reuben doesn't sound too bad, but you keep reading and you see what they mean by great searchings of heart. Speaking to Reuben, Deborah says, "Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling for the flocks?" Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. And Dan, why did he stay with the ships? Asher sat still at the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. And then returning to the faithful, she mentions Zebulun and Naphtali in verse 18. Now remember, this song is sung after the victory, and this is taught to the people. And they sang it together all across Israel. And so this is meant to shame these tribes, Reuben, Dan, the city of Gilead, who wouldn't join their brothers at arms in this battle against the Canaanites. Verse 23 speaks to a village or a town called Meroz. And maybe it's because of this event that we don't know much about Meroz today. Verse 23 says, "Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord." If you remember our studies of angels a few months back in this class, we talked about the angel of the Lord was Yahweh himself, spoke as Yahweh, might have been the second person of the Godhead, but a divine figure, and he's cursing this village, Meroz. Curse its inhabitants thoroughly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, against the mighty. So you had the people who participated and did the work and risked their lives, and then you had the people who didn't. Does that sound familiar to you? That sounds very familiar, right? You've got a group of people here that ought to be unified and working together, and they're equally responsible, but only a fraction of them do the work and take the risks and put their lives on the line and find solutions to the problem. And that's something we're still dealing with today among God's people today. Maybe you've heard the Pareto principle or the 80-20 principle, that 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. I think actually it's 80% of outcomes is done by 20% of causes. But you can simplify it and think of it in human terms. 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. Now, it's not exact, but if you think about it, in a lot of applications, that is the case. At work, in the church, in your home, it seems like 80% of the work is done by 20% of the workforce. And maybe that's just human nature, but it's not right. People seem to enjoy being on the sidelines, like Reuben and these other people, these other tribes that let their brothers fight the battles and put their lives on the line. And why did they do that? It's just easier to sit on the sidelines. You can criticize, you can point to the problems, and you can feel righteous about it without taking the risk of being part of the solution. When you get into the solution, it's messy, right? It's hard. You realize there's more to it than you ever thought. I love these presidential campaigns where the candidates who've never been president before stand up and tell you how they're going to solve all of America's problems. And they make all these promises, and on day one, in my first 100 days, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And their first day in the White House, they start messing everything up. Why? Because life is just super complicated. And if you get off the sidelines and you get involved, you're going to get your hands dirty, and you're going to find out that it's really hard to solve problems. And that's why a lot of people, maybe 80% of the people, like to be over here on the sidelines. I saw some statistics, and these are old statistics now. The numbers are probably worse now than they were when I saw them. This was back before the pandemic, but it was done by the Barna Research Group. And they found in a survey that 73% of Americans still profess to be Christians. So that's still a majority. It's not the number we'd like, and when we say profess Christianity, we're speaking of Christianity generally speaking, not strictly New Testament Christianity. You understand? 73% of people say, I'm a Christian. But when they started digging in and asking questions, they found that only 33% attended a service of the church at least once a month. Once a month. Now, do you consider somebody to be a faithful Christian who goes to church once a month? I'm talking about somebody with no health problems or reasons, to keep them out of the service. They could come, but they choose to come only once a month. Is that a faithful Christian? Out of the 73%, they could only find 33% who came once a month. And then about the same number said they prayed regularly. 40% of that 73% don't pray regularly, but they identify as Christians. And then when you get down to what most of us really think a Christian is, you get into the area of service. Barna found that only 18% of people served their church, or they widened it to any nonprofit on a regular basis or at all. Now that sounds very similar to the numbers of the Pareto principle, 80-20. 73% versus 18%. 18% are doing all the work. 73% are claiming to be Christians. So this is a familiar story that we're seeing here. This unlikely people are made up of a minority faithful and a majority unfaithful people. And we don't want to be on that side of the unfaithful. Unlikely people. Let's go in the third place. Unlikely means. It's funny, I didn't think I had enough material, and I'm only halfway through here, so we won't spend as much time on the means, but this is very interesting. I want you to get this. Not much information is given about the battle in the historical account in chapter 4. Look at verse 15. There is this one detail that's given, and you might pass over it if you're reading too quickly. But think about this. In the battle, the Lord, it says, routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. You're in a chariot. Why are you jumping out of the chariot, driven by a horse, we assume, and running away from an army? How can you expect to have any success in that? And you don't get the reason why in chapter 4. You have to go to Deborah's song to understand in chapter 5. So look at chapter 5, verse 4. This is very interesting. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens dropped, yes, the clouds dropped water. The Lord made it rain in this very arid region. There's more if you go toward the end of the song, verses 20 and 21. From heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. How did the stars fight? The sky, how did it fight? The torrent, the flood, Kishon, that's a brook, swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon, march on, my soul, with might. So basically, chapter 5 tells us that the Lord used the means of a flood to stop them. And this tells us why Sisera's jumping out of that iron chariot. Because you would imagine an iron chariot's pretty heavy, and it's probably about the worst mode of transportation in the mud. Kind of similar to what happened to the Egyptians in the Red Sea. The wheels of the chariots got stuck in the mud, so Sisera had no choice but to jump out and make a run for it. Unusual, unlikely means. Not the way anybody would have guessed this battle would have been won. Finally, look at the unlikely expectations. God's people should expect victory, but unfortunately we lack faith, and often we expect defeat. And by this point in Israel's history, Israel had fallen so low that they didn't think they could fight Canaan. They'd been oppressed for 20 years. But look what happens. They completely surprise the enemy. Look at the end of this. Very interesting ending to this song. It imagines the women of Canaan waiting for their husbands to come home from battle. And they're just sure this is all just a day's work for their men in their chariots of iron, so they don't expect any of them to die in this battle. Yet all of them have been wiped out. So verse 28 is imagining these women, namely the mother of Sisera. Out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera wailed through the lattice. This is her speaking. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Now, she has some women there with her. Verse 29 calls them her wisest princesses. So they answer. They tell her something to calm her nerves. Here's what they say. Verse 30. Have they not found and divided the spoil? They're just dividing up the spoil of the Israelites. A womb or two for every man. A spoil of dyed materials for Sisera. Spoil of dyed materials embroidered. 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for the neck as spoil. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but your friends be like the sun as he rises in his might. So the expectation of the Canaanites was that this was all in a day's work. It's going to be easy. And the mother of Sisera watches and she waits. She rationalizes, and her son never comes home. He never comes home.